Next slide, please. Okay, well, I was asked to give this talk, and I was just given one word to work with, and that word was alien. So what I've decided to talk about is the evolution and standardization of aliens in my lifetime. And that might sound like a strange topic, but I'll explain. First of all, when you mention aliens, the first thing most people want to talk about is, do they exist? And I don't think that's a helpful question here. I think I'm just going to throw that question out. We'll forget about whether they exist or not. Next slide, please. Folklore. Think about folklore and mythology. Every culture's got its folk tales, its myths, its characters. Now this is Western culture. It's just a kind of random selection. So you've got all kinds of people up here. You've got very possibly real humans that may have existed. You've got a flesh and blood American there that was responsible for the deaths of millions of chickens. You've got historical characters that may have existed, people debate that. You've got fertility symbols from pagan eras, advertising logos, fairy tales. You've got all kinds of stuff. But once we got into the space age, kind of post-Second World War, joining this pantheon of characters that we have in our culture, you started to get space aliens, and you got all kinds of space aliens, like 50s B-movie space aliens. We've seen them. If you haven't seen the Lapis Lazuli video yet, check that on YouTube. It's got some classic examples. People in rubber suits looking kind of weird. They look quite laughable now. They were probably quite terrifying at the time. But there was a great diversity of forms that you saw. And in my childhood, in the 70s, we had Doctor Who, we had Star Trek coming from the 60s. Again, mostly humanoid aliens, you know, what costume departments could manage on a limited budget. Humans with extra bits. But occasionally sort of blobby things and more abstract aliens. But the thing was, there was a diversity. There was a diversity of aliens. But then once we got into the 90s, something strange started to happen. Next slide, please. There was this phenomenon of people, mostly North Americans, seriously believing that they'd been abducted by extraterrestrials. And it was a genuine thing that happened. It was a phenomenon. Again, don't worry about the reality of this. These two books kind of were at the core of this phenomenon. So Whitley Strieber's book was his own account of supposedly being abducted by aliens. That's his artist's impression. And John Mack, his book, he was a Harvard psychiatrist or psychologist who was working with people who believed they'd had these experiences. And he couldn't, he was an intelligent man, and he had many different ways he could interpret this, but what he couldn't get past was the fact that their descriptions were all very similar. The types of aliens, the way they looked, the way they behaved, the craft they travelled in, their motives, seeming motives. There was a commonality there, and I think he even started to entertain the possibility that maybe extraterrestrials were genuinely entering the Earth's atmosphere and abducting people. And the description of these aliens, if we were to sort of take an average of it, we've got what then became the sort of classic archetype of 90s aliens. Next slide, please. It's the grey. We all know about the grey. They're these little humanoid things, big heads, skinny, blue-grey skin, these quite menacing, black, glassy, almond-shaped, slanty eyes. They don't look like they're much fun. They're proper aliens. They're not like E.T. or Mr. Spock or the Doctor or Chewbacca. You know, you wouldn't want to hang out with them. They're quite other. They're alien. That's the whole point. But what happened? Where did these aliens come from? And at the time, this is the same time you got rave culture kicking off in the UK in a big way. Next slide, please. And what started to show up all over the place in the sort of, mostly the kind of drug culture, counterculture, which crossed over with electronic music. This logo, it was like a corporate logo. It was everywhere. People had jewellery, they had it printed on clothing, on flyers, and it added this kind of edgy cool to things. It was like, it didn't, well, what does it say? Nobody owned it. It's like a brand. It was like a Nike swoosh or the McDonald's thing or the Rolling Stones lips and tongue thing. But it wasn't about anything. Or it was about aliens, or maybe they exist or something. And I remember this, as I said, rave culture. I remember this day-glow jewellery, and I looked online to see if anyone else remembered that. Next slide, please. Not only do they remember it, you can now get retro 90s alien day-glow jewellery and tie-dyes, so it was a phenomenon at the time. I'm not just imagining this. Also, I'm sure you've all seen a variant on this. Next slide, please. Again, the Take Me to Your Dealer poster, playing on the 50s B-movie, aliens on the White House lawn. We want to come and take me to your leader. We want to deal with your governance. No, the aliens now just want to come and get stoned with us and go to the rave. So we've kind of accepted, like, the alien is down with us, you know. And it started to infect design trends. Next slide, please. I noticed car headlights, and I couldn't find the examples I wanted because I don't know cars very well. But you started to get these more slanty-eyed type kind of cars. Now that red, it's probably a bit small, but this red sports car, I mean, that's obviously a bit expensive, but that looks really alien and really menacing in the same kind of way. Compare that to the one from the 50s or 60s, they probably would have made someone just as happy and proud to own. It looks like quite a happy car, doesn't it? I'm getting some feedback here. Right, next up, now even Space Raiders, these cheap and cheerful 10p packets of crisps that I remember in the 80s with this awful kind of mocked up B-movie alien sci-fi theme. In the 90s they rebranded themselves, and it was about time. But what did they go for? They went for this standard alien archetype, and it's great because nobody owns it. You don't have to pay for the rights to use it, but you're then further propagating this folkloric character. Next slide, please. Even cuddly toys. So the rave generation are now encouraging the next generation to embrace giving children little cute monsters is kind of like the teddy bear thing, you know, you've got this big scary thing, so you give the child a little safe fluffy version and they can feel in control. But these aliens, that's like, who would give that to their, I don't know. It made me, I was a bit suspect about all this. Where is this coming from? What's up with all the aliens? It's like the vampires and the zombies now. Why, maybe someone was behind this. Are we being set up? What's going on? And I wasn't the only one. There was a sort of suspicion around something wasn't quite right. But I think to really understand the phenomenon, of the abductions, or the stories, and also this kind of standardization of the alien into this one format, we have to look at the next slide. Terence McKenna, who probably would have hated being described as a psychedelic prophet, but he was a kind of free-thinking psychedelic enthusiast, and he's been, undermined by his rather unnecessary theory about fractal time waves and the end of the space-time continuum at the end of 2012, because it didn't happen. But he shouldn't be dismissed because he had a lot of good and interesting things to say. He had a lot of things to say, and he knew a lot of things, particularly about, next slide please, this thing called DMT. It's a very powerful psychedelic. Some of you may have heard of it, some of you may have even experienced it. N,N-dimethyltryptamine, one of the most powerful psychedelics known to man, extracted from plant materials. They use it in crystalline form. You can brew it up with other plants and have it in a sort of ayahuasca form, and then it's a kind of slow release version. Or you can smoke the crystal, which is what Terence McKenna ended up doing. He was involved in 60s experiments, 60s US government experiments, and or a friend was and got some for him, something like that. But he did an awful lot of it. And most people would probably only do it once or twice. It's so powerful, it's not something you can kind of get a habit of doing. But he was quite intrepid, and he learned to navigate this kind of crazy infinite dimensional hyperspace that you get thrust into for about 15 minutes by smoking this stuff. And he got so familiar with the space that after a while he got to meet certain beings that apparently dwelled there, and he described them as machine elves, and he said they were part language, part machine and part biology, and they spoke in this kind of higher dimensional geometric visual language, and they wanted to show you something. And his descriptions, I've read enough of his descriptions and other people's descriptions which match them, that it makes me, the way I would describe it to you is like you live in a downstairs flat and you don't even know there's an upstairs. But upstairs is like Canterbury Cathedral times 1,000,000, and there's these weird beings up there doing stuff you're never going to understand. And somebody comes around with this stuff, and you smoke some of it, and suddenly your head is pushed through the ceiling, and suddenly, where am I? What the hell is this? There's this whole world you didn't know about. And these beings see a head sticking through the ceiling, or sort of through the floor, and they rush up and encircle you and try and show you things and try and demonstrate things to you. And you've got this brief moment of contact with these very otherworldly beings in this hyper-real environment. Everyone who's experienced this seems to emphasize its reality. It seems as real as this. It's like someone's just changed the channel in your consciousness. Next slide, please. But one of the things that McKenna observed, and which has since been sort of further developed by Rick Strassman, this researcher, with his book and film, The Spirit Molecule, is the similarity with near-death experiences. So people you've heard about these, I'm sure, when people have almost died, but then they've been yanked back from death in some emergency medical situation, and they have this amazing memory of travelling through this tunnel of golden light to this garden or paradise or amazing palatial space, and there are angels or there are their ancestors or their beloved departed ones. And some people would interpret that, if they were religious, as that they've been to heaven. If they weren't religious, maybe that would make them religious, or maybe they'd come up with some sceptical explanation. But in any case, McKenna noticed the similarity between the DMT trip and the near-death experience. And he also noted that it's been shown that DMT exists in the body anyway. If you've never had any, it's in you. We all have it in our bodies. It's manufactured almost certainly by the brain. The best hypothesis at the moment is it's the pineal gland, which is like your third eye. And it's in us, and so it's possible. One theory suggests it's the mechanism behind dreaming, because dream logic and DMT logic are quite similar. But so McKenna's idea was that on the threshold of death, when your brain is convinced that that's it now, you've only got a microsecond left, it squirts some DMT out to give you this amazing psychedelic experience. And hence people who are then retrieved from the edge of death remember this and try and interpret it. Why that would be the case is very mysterious. There's no Darwinian explanation as to why we would have evolved that kind of thing. It doesn't have any survival value, so it's just a very interesting phenomenon. But McKenna also noticed a similarity with the alien abduction experiences, in that the encounters with these beings, I mean, it was a more fear-based experience, the alien abduction, but you were similarly taken into this otherworldly space surrounded by beings that wanted to interact with you, sometimes in quite unpleasant ways I won't go into. But the alien abduction stories, he looked at enough of them in the 90s, having been smoking DMT for decades, and he thought, what's going on here is people are having spontaneous self-generating DMT trips. And the sort of scenario he suggests is, you're driving across America, you've been driving all day, it's getting dark, you're getting fatigued, and you've just been staring at the road, and you're kind of starting to almost trip out a bit. And it's getting dark, and there's no one around, and there's middle of nowhere in Nebraska, and you see a light suddenly out of nowhere. You've just maybe come up over the brow of a hill, or you've caught the reflection of something, but you have a moment of panic, and then the panic makes you panic. You know how that can happen? You get that jolt of fear, and then you start thinking, oh, what's happening? So you pull over to the side of the road just to kind of calm down, but you don't. You go into a kind of downward panic spiral, and then for some reason we don't understand, your brain does the DMT release, and 15 minutes later you're like, what the hell just happened? You've had this hyper-real experience, not a dream, not some woozy hallucination, and there was these beings, they were doing stuff to you, and there was this weird space. So McKenna said, okay, the UFO experience is, the abduction experience is a self-generated DMT experience, and it's nothing new. So let's look at the evolution of the craft which the supposed alien abductors travel in. Next slide, please. So this is your classic 1950s B-movie Flying Saucer. This is based on late 40s, basically eyewitness accounts. In about 1947, people all over America started seeing fleets of silver discs in the sky, and it wasn't considered, it didn't make you a weirdo to report that to the local press. It was just this new thing happening, and they assumed it was Russian spy planes or something. And there was enough of these reported and artists' impressions and things that now, by the 50s, you had an idea that's what they looked like. And when aliens abducted people in the 50s, because there are stories from back then, they were in these kind of 50s-style jet-set silvery thing, 50s style spaceships, and they had long blonde hair and they came from Venus. But then by the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, the spaceships start to look more modern. It's like car design. They get the angles and curves change and the window placements change. And so if you check out some artists' impressions of 90s UFOs, they look much more 90s. And the aliens are suddenly claiming they come from Zeta Reticula. That's where the greys supposedly come from, which is further away. We now know there isn't obviously life on Venus, but the aliens now claim to come from somewhere else, and their spaceships have evolved in tandem with our own design trends, which is kind of weird. Now you go back into the 19th century, next slide please, there was a phantom airship phenomenon in North America. People were seeing airships phantom airships, sometimes with humanoid beings in them, strange things going on. It got all over the press. I'm sure there were skeptics dismissing it. But the point is, this was before the space age. And so the space age version, McKenna says, when you encounter these beings, you have to project onto them the clothing that your culture gives you based on your folklore and mythology. So in the space age, you encounter these beings, they're in a spaceship, they're aliens from outer space. In the 1870s or 90s, you encounter a phantom airship with beings from Mars or something, maybe. Next slide, please. If you're in 1920s Portugal, you encounter the Virgin Mary, like thousands of people seemingly did in a field near Fatima after 3 little kids received a prophecy. Something weird happened with a big luminous disc in the sky, and we don't know what it was, but the people at the time saw the Virgin Mary because that was what that was. The point is, there's something which is there and it isn't there. It's not visually there. And McKenna had this theory that basically human consciousness was going to reach a point of convergence where it was going to assume a kind of unity and then exit from reality and basically construct a sort of hyperdimensional vehicle to blast off from reality into all possible realities and rove around in the worlds of all possible imaginary universes. Quite a grandiose future vision, and the idea being that our overmind, as he called it, or oversoul, this future human totality of consciousness, occasionally passes through and we make contact with it, and it's checking us out. We don't know what we're looking at. It's looking at us through something, and it's there but it's not there, so we project onto it whatever's in our cultural memory banks. And the point is you don't have to, in this case the Virgin Mary is pretty obvious. Next slide please. If you're in rural Ireland, say, in centuries earlier, you'd see the little people, the fairies, the leprechauns, the elves, whatever region of Northern Europe you were in, there'd be different names and slightly different descriptions. The secret commonwealth that you didn't really like you talking about them. But this fits with McKenna's idea that basically somebody walking across the bog at night, home from the pub, gets a bit spooked, sees a light, starts to panic, has a self-generated DMT experience, remembers contact with this being. That's not to say they just imagined it. No, they made contact with a being on the other side of this veil, which this chemical seems to allow. But the form, the visual form it takes in 16th century southwest Ireland would be more like this than a space alien. Now, why was everyone in the 90s seeing these greys, these classic greys? Next slide, please. McKenna's theory was that the first serious major blockbuster film, post-50s B-movie, which portrayed alien contact in a realistic kind of way, Steven Spielberg's Close Encounters of the Third Kind, featured these little humanoids, and they're pretty close to the greys. I mean, the eyes are a bit wrong, but they give you the general idea. And the idea is this went into millions and millions of pairs of eyes and burned itself into many people's consciousness. It's a powerful film. And even people that didn't see that film are going to be affected. It kind of sort of embeds itself in this cultural memory bank, this collective unconscious that we all have access to. Next slide, please. These ideas aren't as wacky as they might seem, in that Jung, who's taken fairly seriously in psychology, came up with this idea of the collective unconscious, this shared zone of imagination that we all have access to. And it wasn't just him. Next slide. Henri Corbin, French theologian, studied Islamic mysticism from the 12th and 13th centuries and came up with this idea of the mundus imaginalis. And this is a realm between the physical world and the spirit world. It's the world you access in your imagination. But your imagination isn't what you've been told. It's not just a playground for children to imagine things. No, that's just the front porch. That's just the lobby. If you've got the discipline to get into the main building, that's the upstairs flat. That's the Canterbury Cathedral times 1,000,000. And that's inhabited. That's got a population. You can get to know them. And people like Emanuel Swedenborg went there and wrote these detailed kind of descriptions of these societies of angels. Next slide, please. The Tibetans, they catalogued these huge genealogies of demons and various types of beings that they inherited from earlier shamanic forms. Next slide, please. Even South Park got this pretty accurate, really, with their imagination land trio. If you've not seen that, it's a surprisingly intelligent exploration of these ideas of sort of a shared level of mind. So, where will, if these beings, if we're encountering something completely outside us, and it doesn't have any visual form, and we've been in the space age, so we've been seeing space aliens, But the space age is kind of defunct now. No one really believes we're going to go off and populate other planets and galaxies. That's retro now. That was something we were promised in the 50s and 60s, and we kind of believed it for a while, and now nobody believes we're going to do that. So what's the new myth? What's the new zone, the new environment? Next, please. This is where aliens might show up next, I think. This is a new obsession, and you're going to hear more about this if you haven't already. Transhumanism, singularitarianism, the boo, the singularity. This idea that human consciousness is going to fuse with machines and reach some super level of computational ability, and we'll just be able to exit physical, messy, smelly reality and just live inside machine consciousness. Well, if this starts to happen, and there are people who are really into it, and it worries me, in that environment, I think that's rife. You're going to get these beings poking their heads through. You know, it only takes a few electrons moving around in a transistor. So when you're dealing with artificial intelligences and you don't know if someone's human or they're not, if they're a machine, maybe there's something else again. So watch out for the aliens if you go into virtual reality. So, in conclusion, although we can't rule out that there might actually have been alien meddling in human affairs, I'm talking about real physical aliens from outer space now. If you look at ancient mythology, plenty of stories of gods from the sky coming and messing with us. And there's a lot of dodgy literature on that, but there's also some intelligent stuff too. If you check out Robert Temple's work on the Dogon people of Africa and their awareness of the Sirius star system, that's pretty convincing. Anyway, so it might be there's aliens outside in outer space too. There's also kind of more of a New Age cult belief that there are these benevolent aliens. They're usually from the Pleiades. They're kind of watching over us. They're delivering us messages of love and truth and light through channelers who all seem to live in California, and they've supposedly been preventing us from destroying ourselves because this Earth is this precious library of genetic material, which is a higher dimensional form of information storage. So that might be true, I don't know, I haven't got an opinion. There's also the theory that we might be getting set up for a fake alien invasion, because can you tell anymore if something's real or not? I mean, if you've been paying attention, you'll know what I mean. There's a lot of fictionalized news these days. So, that might all be true, but basically the aliens, the mainstream alien encounters I've been talking about through the ages in all their forms, fairies, phantom airships, greys, Venusians with long blonde hair, all of them are... I've lost my threads. They're all, I know, sorry. They're inner space aliens. They're not outer space aliens. They are inner space aliens. So, what's all this? We're here to listen to music. What's all this got to do with music? I've asked myself. And really, the best thing we've got to go on really is the Celtic fairy traditions, which was, you know, that was contact with these other worlds. And there were a lot of, next slide please, stories of fiddlers, usually drunken fiddlers coming home from the pub, and they're walking across some bog and they see a light, and then a fairy fiddler comes out and teaches them a tune, and they go home and wake up like, wow, did that really happen? But they still remember the tune, and they go down the pub and they introduce the tune to their friends. The tune becomes part of the repertoire. So there is actually music in the Irish folk repertoire, supposedly of alien origin, if you call it that. These days, probably of all the genres of music, most alien-friendly, I'd say the psytrance scene is carrying on that techno tradition of embracing the alien. Got to give a shout to Hawkwind, space rocks, dating back to 1969, embracing the inner alien, outer alien thing, long before even I was born. And the Pleiadians apparently have got music. You can buy CDs of music channeled from the Pleiades, but it sounds surprisingly like inept New Age music. So I wouldn't recommend that. If I was going to recommend somebody to act as a kind of ambassador, musical ambassador, because music's been used, well, in Close Encounters of the Third Kind, music was used to communicate with aliens, and music is basically an expression of number. Relationships between number expressed through time, harmony and rhythm are all about number and time. And number is the one thing that would cut across all worlds or reality. So outer space aliens, inner space aliens could very possibly have something like music. So next slide please. My first choice would be Sun Ra, the great psychedelic band leader, free jazz. And there's a line from one of his songs, which, I mean, he claimed to be from the planet Venus and be thousands of years old, and he came across as somewhat ridiculous, probably, in some people's eyes, but he knew what was going on, and he said, "There are other worlds they have not told you of. They wish to speak to you. They wish to speak to you." So if we were going to have a conversation, Sunra passed away in '93, left this earthly reality. If we're going to speak back to these other worlds, I can't think of a better set of musical denizens than these people.